Hello there, and welcome to The Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into one of the deepest and most mysterious questions we can ask, the nature of consciousness itself. But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a joy to see all the places we gather from, each in our own little slice of time. Now feel free to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's gently begin our journey into consciousness together. And if your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly fine. Let it drift. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story. Time equals, quote, 3 seconds, quote, / greater than. There is a quiet detail about your life that is so constant, so familiar, that it almost disappears from view. It is not your thoughts, not your memories, not even your body. It is the simple fact that you are experiencing anything at all. Right now, as you listen, there is a soft sense of being here. Perhaps you notice the sound of my voice, or the faint hum of something in the background. Maybe there is a subtle feeling in your hands or a slight awareness of your breath moving in and out. All of it, every sound, every sensation, every thought, appears somewhere. And that somewhere is what we're calling consciousness. It may seem like a small shift in language, but it changes everything. Because if you pause for just a moment and gently turn your attention inward, you may begin to notice something unusual. Everything you have ever known has appeared inside this field of experience. Every memory you carry, every place you've been, every person you've met, all of it has been known to you only because it showed up here, within this quiet space of awareness. Even the idea of a world out there is something that appears as an experience within you, and this is where the mystery begins to deepen. Imagine for a moment that something important happens in your life, a conversation perhaps, a decision you need to make. Now try to imagine going through that moment without any experience at all, no feeling, no awareness, no sense of being there. It becomes almost impossible to picture, because without consciousness, there is no life as you know it. It is not just one part of your life, it is the stage on which everything happens. You could almost say, it is the only place your life has ever existed. And yet, strangely, we almost never think about it. We think about what we are experiencing. We think about the world, about other people, about our plans, our worries, our memories, but we rarely stop to notice the simple fact that all of this is appearing somewhere, and that somewhere is always present. It is like a screen that never turns off. No matter what is playing, joy, boredom, curiosity, confusion, the screen itself remains quiet, unnoticed, constant, and because it is always there, it becomes invisible. There is another way to see this more clearly. Think about your day to day. Maybe you woke up, checked your phone, moved through a routine that felt almost automatic. At times, your mind may have wandered, drifting from one thought to another, barely noticing the world around you, and yet, even in those moments, there was still an experience. Even when you were lost in thought, something was aware of those thoughts. Even when you weren't paying attention, there was still a quiet presence in which everything unfolded. This is what makes consciousness so unusual. It is not something you can step outside of. You can question your beliefs. You can doubt your memories. You can even be mistaken about what you see or hear. But you cannot doubt that something is being experienced, because even doubt itself appears as an experience. And so, in a very quiet way, consciousness becomes the most certain thing we know. Not because we can measure it easily, not because we can explain it, but because it is the one thing we cannot escape. And yet, when scientists try to study it, they run into a strange problem. They can measure the brain, they can observe behaviour, they can track electrical patterns, chemical signals, and networks of activity. But none of these measurements seem to capture the feeling of experience itself. It is as if there is a gap. On one side, there is the physical world, neurons firing, signals moving, systems interacting. On the other side, there is the quiet, undeniable fact that something feels like something, that there is a colour, a sound, a sensation, that there is something it is like to be you right now. And bridging that gap has turned out to be one of the most difficult challenges in all of science. But before we move too quickly into theories and explanations, it is worth staying here for just a little longer with this simple observation that your entire life, every moment you've ever known, has taken place within this gentle, ever-present field of awareness, like a soft horizon that never quite comes into focus, always there, always holding everything. And perhaps, as you begin to settle into this idea, you may notice something subtle, a sense of quiet curiosity, because once you see it, even faintly, it becomes difficult to ignore. This place where everything happens, this silent backdrop to your entire life. The question is no longer just, what is the world made of? But something softer and perhaps even stranger. What is this that knows the world at all? And as we continue, we'll begin to gently explore what we actually mean by this word, consciousness, and why something so familiar can remain so deeply mysterious. As you rest here, perhaps a little more aware of this quiet field in which everything appears, it becomes natural to ask a very simple question. What exactly do we mean when we say consciousness? It sounds like a familiar word, something we use often, without hesitation, and yet, when we try to define it clearly, it begins to slip, just slightly, out of reach. Because in everyday language, consciousness is often mixed together with many other things. We might think of it as intelligence, or thought, or the ability to reason, to plan, to reflect. But in this exploration, we're pointing to something much simpler, something more immediate. Consciousness, in its most basic sense, is not thinking. It is not memory. It is not language. It is not even understanding. It is the simple fact that something is being felt. Right now, for example, there may be the faint sensation of your body resting, the subtle rhythm of your breath, the quiet presence of sound. Even if no words are forming in your mind, even if no clear thoughts are present, there is still something, a gentle knowing, a soft awareness. That alone is enough. And this is where an important distinction begins to unfold, because thinking can come and go. You may have noticed this already. There are moments when your mind is busy, full of ideas, plans, and inner conversations, and there are other moments, quieter ones, where thought fades into the background. Perhaps when you're watching something beautiful, or listening to music, or simply drifting just before sleep. In those moments, thinking becomes softer, sometimes almost disappearing, and yet, experience remains. There is still a sense of being there, still a presence. This tells us something very important, that consciousness does not depend on thought. It can exist without it. To see this more clearly, imagine a very young child. Before language has fully formed, before concepts have been built, there are still sensations, light and colour, sound and warmth, the feeling of touch, the The child may not understand what these things are, but they are still experienced. In a similar way, we can imagine much simpler forms of life. A small organism moving through its environment, not planning, not reflecting, but perhaps sensing something. A faint shift in temperature, a subtle contact with its surroundings. We cannot know exactly what such an experience would feel like, but we can begin to see the possibility that consciousness, at its core, may be something very minimal, just a flicker of sensation, just a trace of experience. Philosophers sometimes describe this idea in a different way. Instead of trying to define consciousness directly, they ask a question: what is it like to be something? What is it like to be you right now? There is a certain quality to your experience, a texture, a feeling, and this quality is something that cannot be fully captured in words. You can describe the color blue, but the actual experience of seeing blue is something different. You can explain the sound of music, but the feeling of hearing it cannot be transferred through explanation alone. In this sense, consciousness is not something we can easily define from the outside. It is something that must be known from within. There is even a quiet realization hidden here, that we may never find a perfect definition, not because consciousness is vague, but because it is too direct, too close. It is like trying to describe the taste of water, or the feeling of being awake. Any definition we give will always point back to experience itself, and so, instead of defining it precisely, we begin to circle around it, using examples, using metaphors, using gentle comparisons, because that is the closest we can come. Now, there is another subtle shift that begins to happen as we explore this idea. If consciousness is simply experience, then it may not be as rare or as special as we once assumed. We often imagine that consciousness belongs only to complex beings, to humans perhaps, or to animals with advanced brains. But if we strip it down to its most basic form, a simple feeling, a faint awareness, then the question begins to open. Could there be experiences that are far simpler than our own? Not thoughts, not language, not identity, just sensation, a kind of minimal presence. This is not something we can easily answer, but it gently loosens one of our strongest assumptions, that consciousness must look like us in order to exist. And as this assumption softens, a new kind of curiosity begins to emerge, because the mystery is no longer just about the human mind. It becomes something broader, more open, more uncertain, and perhaps more beautiful. Before we move further, it is worth noticing how unusual this situation is. We are trying to understand something that is always present, something that we cannot step outside of, something that cannot be observed in the same way we observe the world. And so, the tools we normally rely on, definitions, measurements, clear boundaries, begin to feel just slightly inadequate, not useless, but incomplete. And this is why the study of consciousness has always carried a certain feeling of mystery, not because it is distant, but because it is so close, so immediate, so quietly constant, that it becomes difficult to see clearly, like trying to notice the air around you, or the background hum of a room that has always been there. And yet, as we continue to look more carefully, something begins to take shape, a realization that consciousness is not the same as thinking, not the same as intelligence, not even the same as being human. It is something simpler, and at the same time, something deeper, a kind of presence that underlies everything we experience. And as we carry this understanding forward, we begin to approach the next question, a question that has puzzled scientists and philosophers for decades. Not just what consciousness is, but why it exists at all. Why there is any experience, anywhere, in a universe that, at first glance, seems to be made only of matter. And as we move gently into that question, the mystery begins to deepen. Not sharply, not abruptly, but in the same quiet way a thought expands, just before it disappears into sleep. There is a quiet turning point that often arrives, once we begin to understand what we mean by consciousness. At first, the idea feels simple. Experience is happening. There is something it is like to be here. But then, almost without warning, a deeper question begins to take shape. Not just what consciousness is, but why it exists at all. And this is where the mystery becomes more difficult, more subtle, and, in a way, more unsettling. Because when we look at the world through the lens of science, we see something very different. We see a universe made of patterns and processes, tiny particles interacting, fields stretching across space, energy moving, transforming, combining. We see stars forming, galaxies spinning, atoms bonding into molecules, molecules forming into cells, cells organizing into living systems, and eventually, in one small corner of the universe, a human brain, a structure of extraordinary complexity, billions of tiny units, each sending signals to others, a constant flow of activity, patterns forming and dissolving, signals rising and falling. And from this perspective, everything seems to follow a kind of continuity. Simple systems become more complex, interactions become richer, structures become more organized. But nowhere in this description do we find anything that looks like experience. Nowhere do we see the color red, or the feeling of warmth, or the sound of a voice. We see only movement, only structure, only interaction. And yet, somehow, experience appears. Somewhere along this chain, something begins to feel like something. And this is the heart of what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. It can be expressed in a very simple way. Why does any physical process feel like anything at all? Why is there an inner experience instead of only outer behavior? To understand why this is so difficult, it helps to notice something subtle. Science is very good at explaining how things work. It can tell us how light enters the eye, how signals travel along nerves, how the brain processes information, how decisions are formed. It can map these processes with incredible detail. But all of these explanations describe relationships, one thing causing another, signals triggering responses, patterns giving rise to behavior. They describe what happens, but they do not explain why it feels like something. For example, imagine describing the process of seeing a color. Science can explain how light of a certain wavelength, meaning a certain pattern of waves, enters the eye, how it is converted into electrical signals, how those signals travel to the brain, and how the brain responds. Every step can be mapped, every mechanism described. And yet, none of those steps explain the experience of seeing that color, the actual feeling of it, the simple, immediate presence of blue, or green, or red. There is a gap, a quiet space between description and experience, and this gap does not seem to close, no matter how much detail we add. We can describe the brain in finer and finer ways. We can measure more precisely. We can observe more carefully. But the question remains, why is there something it is like to be that system? This is why it is called the hard problem, not because it is impossible, but because it is fundamentally different from the kinds of problems science usually solves. Sometimes this is explained by comparing two types of questions. There are questions about function. How does the brain recognize a face? How does it store memory? How does it control movement? These are incredibly complex questions, but they are in principle answerable through observation and explanation. Then there is a different kind of question. Why does recognizing a face feel like something? Why does memory have a sense of being remembered? Why does any of this have an inequality at all? And this second type of question does not seem to yield in the same way. It resists explanation, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like something that remains just out of reach. Now, there are many different ways people respond to this mystery. Some believe that eventually science will explain it, that as we understand the brain more deeply, the gap will close. Others feel that something more fundamental is missing. That consciousness may not be something that emerges from matter, but something that is built into the fabric of reality itself. And many simply remain uncertain, willing to explore without rushing to a conclusion. But regardless of where one stands, there is something undeniable here. That consciousness presents a challenge unlike any other, because it is not something we observe from the outside. It is something we are from the inside, and this creates a kind of unusual situation. We are trying to understand the very thing that makes understanding possible. We are using thought to examine the space in which thought appears, and perhaps this is why the mystery feels so persistent, so difficult to grasp. It is not hidden somewhere far away. It is not waiting to be discovered in a distant galaxy, or inside a particle accelerator, or at the edge of the universe. It is here, always here, quietly present in every moment, and yet still not fully understood. As we continue, the question begins to shift slightly. If we cannot yet explain why consciousness exists, perhaps we can begin by asking something a little more practical. When does it appear? What changes? When it fades? What patterns in the brain seem to accompany it? And in exploring those questions, science begins to take a different path, not solving the mystery directly, but gently tracing its outline, like following the edges of something that cannot yet be fully seen. And in that process, new insights begin to emerge, not answers exactly, but clues, subtle patterns that hint at something deeper, waiting to be understood. After sitting with the depth of the hard problem, it might begin to feel as though we have reached a kind of wall, a quiet boundary where explanation seems to fade, and yet science does not stop there. Instead, it takes a small step to the side. If we cannot yet answer why consciousness exists, perhaps we can begin with a softer question. When does it appear? When does it fade? What changes when experience is present compared to when it is not? This shift may seem subtle, but it is incredibly important, because rather than trying to solve the mystery all at once, science begins to trace its edges, carefully, patiently, like someone exploring a dark room, not by turning on a light, but by gently feeling along the walls. One of the ways scientists do this is by observing the brain, not in a harsh or invasive way, but by quietly watching patterns of activity. They use tools that can detect changes in blood flow or tiny electrical signals, allowing them to see which parts of the brain are more active at certain times. You might think of it like listening to a city at night. When certain areas are busy, lights are on, movement is happening. When others are quiet, everything slows. By watching these patterns, scientists begin to notice something, that certain states of the brain tend to go along with certain states of experience. For example, consider sleep. There are moments in sleep when dreams arise, vivid, immersive, sometimes strange, And there are other moments when everything seems to go quiet. No images, no thoughts, no sense of time passing. By comparing the brain during these different phases, scientists can begin to see patterns, not the experience itself, but the conditions that seem to accompany it. A similar approach is used with anesthesia. When someone is given medication that gently removes consciousness, they do not disappear physically. The brain is still active, signals are still moving, and yet the experience fades. It becomes inaccessible, almost as if the lights are still on, but the room is no longer being perceived, and when the person wakes, consciousness returns, gradually, softly, like a horizon reappearing at dawn. By studying these transitions, science begins to build a kind of map. Not a map of what consciousness is, but of when it is likely to be present. These are sometimes called the patterns that go along with consciousness. Instead of asking, what is experience made of? The question becomes, what patterns in the brain tend to appear when experience is there? And this shift allows something important to happen. Progress, slow, careful, but real. For instance, researchers have found that when the brain is in a conscious state, its activity tends to be both rich and connected. Different regions of the brain are not just working in isolation, they are communicating, sharing information, like different parts of an orchestra, listening to one another, adjusting, responding, creating something together. But when consciousness fades, this coordination often changes. The brain may still be active, but the patterns become more repetitive, more isolated, less like a conversation, and more like separate voices, no longer in sync. Another way to picture this is to imagine a large network of lights. When the system is fully active, lights flicker across the network in complex patterns, spreading, interacting, evolving. But when the system becomes quieter, the lights may still turn on, but they do so in simpler ways, repeating, not travelling as far. And somewhere within this difference, consciousness seems to arise and fade. There's also another gentle insight that begins to appear. That consciousness may not be about a single place in the brain, not one specific location or one isolated process, but rather a pattern, a relationship, a way in which different parts come together and interact. This helps explain something subtle, why you can still see something, but not notice it. Perhaps you have experienced this before, looking at something directly, but not really registering it. Your eyes are working, the information is entering the brain, and yet it does not fully appear in your awareness. Only when attention shifts, when the signal becomes more widely shared, does it become something you are clearly conscious of, like a whisper that becomes a voice. And so, a new picture begins to form, not the final answer, but direction. That consciousness may be less about what the brain is made of, and more about how it behaves, how it connects, how it shares, how information moves across the whole. This does not solve the hard problem. It does not explain why these patterns feel like something, but it does something else. It gives us a way to study consciousness without fully understanding it, to observe its presence, even if its nature remains unclear. And perhaps this is how many discoveries begin, not with a complete explanation, but with careful observation, with noticing patterns, and slowly learning how they relate. As we continue, something interesting begins to happen. These observations, these patterns, start to challenge our assumptions. They begin to suggest that what we feel and what is actually happening may not always align. That some of our most natural intuitions may be gently misleading us. And so, the journey continues, not by rushing toward answers, but by learning to question what once felt obvious. And in that quiet questioning, the mystery begins to unfold in new and unexpected ways. As we continue this quiet exploration, a new question begins to take shape. If consciousness is not tied to a single place in the brain, if it is not simply about activity, but about patterns, then what kind of pattern might allow something to become part of your experience? Why is it that some things appear clearly in your awareness, while others remain just outside of it? You may have already noticed this in your own life. There are moments when you are looking directly at something, and yet you do not truly see it. Perhaps you're walking through a familiar room, your eyes passing over objects you've seen many times before, but your mind is elsewhere, lost in thought. And so, even though the light enters your eyes, even though the brain is receiving the signals, the experience does not fully arrive. It remains faint, unnoticed. Then, suddenly, something shifts, your attention turns, and the object becomes vivid, clear, present, almost as if it has just appeared, even though it was there all along. This simple experience hints at something deeper, that consciousness may not be about what information enters the brain, but about what information becomes widely available within it. Some scientists describe this idea in a gentle way. They suggest that, for something to become part of your conscious experience, it must be shared across many parts of the brain, not just processed quietly in one corner, but made available, like a message that spreads. You might imagine this like a dark room. At first, there are many objects inside, but they are difficult to see. Then, a soft light begins to move. Wherever the light touches, things become visible, not because they suddenly exist, but because they are now illuminated. In a similar way, information in the brain may already be present, but only becomes conscious when it is lit up in this broader sense, when it is no longer local, but global. Another way to picture this is to imagine a stage. Behind the curtain, there are many actors, preparing, moving, adjusting. But only when someone steps onto the stage, into the light, do they become part of the performance you are aware of. And this stepping into the light may be what transforms a signal into an experience. This idea helps explain something that might have seemed puzzling before, why you can respond to things without being aware of them. For example, you might hear a sound in the background, and your body reacts slightly. Your attention shifts, even before you consciously register the sound. Or you might avoid an obstacle while walking, without ever forming a clear awareness of it. In these cases, the brain is clearly processing information, but that information has not fully entered your conscious experience. It has not yet reached the stage or the light, and so it remains in the background, quietly influencing behavior without becoming part of what you feel. This suggests something both simple and profound, that consciousness may be less about detecting information and more about sharing it, about making it available across the system. There is also something else that begins to emerge from this idea, that consciousness is not constant, but fluctuates, gently rising and falling, as different signals move into and out of the shared space. At any given moment, only a small portion of what the brain processes becomes part of your awareness. The rest continues quietly, beneath the surface, like currents beneath the ocean, always moving, even when unseen. This brings us to a subtle but important realization, that your experience of the world is not a complete picture. It is a selection, a curated view, shaped by what becomes available and what does not. And this selection happens so smoothly, so naturally, that we rarely notice it. We feel as though we are seeing everything, hearing everything, knowing everything that matters. But in truth, most of what the brain is doing remains hidden, and only a small portion becomes the world you experience. This does not mean that your experience is false, but it does mean that it is partial, a kind of window rather than the whole landscape. And within this window, consciousness unfolds, not as a fixed thing, but as a dynamic process, a gentle interplay of signals becoming shared, becoming visible, and then fading again, like light moving across a surface, illuminating one area while leaving others in shadow. And perhaps, as you sit with this idea, you may begin to notice it more clearly in your own experience. The way attention shifts, bringing certain things forward while others recede. The way a thought becomes vivid and then dissolves. The way a sound appears and then disappears into silence. All of this is part of the same quiet process, the brain, in its own intricate way, allowing certain patterns to come into view. And this view is what you experience as consciousness. But even as this picture becomes clearer, something else begins to stir, because if consciousness depends on what is shared, on what becomes widely available, then it raises a deeper question. What about the things that never reach that stage? What about the processes that shape your behaviour without ever becoming visible? What does that say about the role of consciousness itself? Is it truly in control as it feels, or is it something that arrives just a little later, quietly observing what has already begun? And as we gently move into that question, the ground beneath our intuitions begins to shift. There is a quiet way to understand something, not by watching how it appears, but by noticing how it disappears. And when it comes to consciousness, one of the most revealing moments is not when it turns on, but when it fades away. You may have experienced this many times without giving it much thought. The slow drift into sleep, when thoughts begin to loosen, when the edges of the world soften, and then, without a clear boundary, everything slips into silence, or perhaps the opposite, waking up, gently returning, as shapes, sounds, and sensations begin to gather again, as if the world is being rebuilt piece by piece. These everyday transitions already tell us something important, that consciousness is not always present in the same way. It can dim, it can dissolve, and then it can return. But there are other situations, more controlled, ones where this change becomes easier to observe. One of the most fascinating is anesthesia. When someone is given a carefully measured dose of medication, something very specific happens. They do not vanish. Their body remains. Their brain remains active. If you were to look closely, you would still see signals moving, patterns forming, activity continuing. And yet, the experience disappears. There's no awareness of the room, no sense of time passing, no memory forming. It is not like sleep, where dreams may arise. It is more like a quiet absence, a pause, in which nothing seems to be experienced at all. And when the person returns, they often describe it in a very particular way, not as if time passed quickly, but as if there was no time at all. One moment they are there, and the next they are back, with nothing in between. This creates a very interesting puzzle, because if the brain is still active, if signals are still moving, then what exactly has changed? Why does experience disappear, even though activity remains? As scientists began to explore this question, they noticed something subtle, It was not the amount of activity that mattered most, it was the way the activity was organised, in a conscious state. The brain tends to behave like a connected network. Different regions communicate with one another. Information travels across distances. Signals are not isolated, but shared. You might imagine this like a group of musicians playing together, each one contributing, but also listening, adjusting, responding. The music emerges not from one instrument alone, but from the coordination between them. Now imagine that something begins to disrupt this coordination. The musicians are still playing, their instruments still making sound, but they're no longer in sync. Some play faster, some slower, some drift apart entirely. The sound is still there, but the harmony is gone in a similar way under anesthesia. The brain's activity often becomes less coordinated. Regions that once communicated begin to fall out of rhythm. Signals may still occur, but they no longer travel as freely. The network, in a sense, loses its voice. And without this shared activity, consciousness fades. Another way to picture this is to imagine a vast web of connections. In a conscious state, information can move across the web, spreading, interacting, reaching distant points. But when this movement becomes restricted, when signals remain local, the larger pattern begins to break down, and with it, the experience. This leads to a gentle but important insight. That consciousness may depend not on how much the brain is doing, but on how well its parts are working together. Not just activity, but relationship. Not just motion, but coordination. There is also something else worth noticing, that these changes are reversible when the effects of anesthesia wear off. The coordination returns, the signals begin to flow again, the network reconnects, and consciousness reappears. Gradually, softly, like light returning to a room at dawn. This reversibility is what makes anesthesia such a powerful window into consciousness, because it allows scientists to observe the same brain, moving between conscious and unconscious states, not in theory, but in real time. And from these observations, a picture begins to emerge. That consciousness is not tied to a single structure, not something located in one place, but something that arises when the system as a whole reaches a certain kind of balance, a balance between activity and integration, between parts and the whole. If the system becomes too disconnected, consciousness fades. If it becomes too rigid, too repetitive, it may also fade. What seems to matter is a kind of rich, flowing interaction, a dynamic exchange, where information is both diverse and shared, like a conversation that is neither silent nor chaotic but alive. And yet, even as this picture becomes clearer, the deeper mystery remains, because we are still describing patterns, still observing relationships, still mapping activity. But we have not yet explained why these patterns feel like something, why this coordination gives rise to experience. And so, once again, we find ourselves in a familiar place, learning more, seeing further, but still standing at the edge of a question that has not yet been answered. As we continue, something interesting begins to happen. These scientific insights, these patterns of connection and disconnection, start to gently challenge the way we see ourselves. They begin to suggest that what we feel as immediate and obvious may not always reflect what is actually happening beneath the surface, that some of our deepest intuitions about awareness, about control, about the self, may need to be re-examined, not rejected, but softened, looked at again from a slightly different angle. And as that process begins, the journey becomes less about finding a single answer and more about learning to see, more clearly. There are moments in life when you just know something, a quiet feeling that something isn't quite right, or perhaps the opposite, a calm sense that everything is safe. You might walk into a room and immediately feel at ease, or, without any clear reason, feel a subtle tension. Nothing obvious has happened, no clear signal, no conscious thought, and yet the feeling is there. This is what we often call intuition. It is not loud. It does not arrive as a sentence or a calculation. It arrives as a sense, a quiet leaning of the mind toward yes or no, towards safety or caution. And in many cases, intuition is remarkably useful. Over time, through experience and evolution, the brain has learned to notice patterns we are not consciously aware of. Tiny details, a shift in someone's voice, a small change in posture, a subtle inconsistency in an environment. All of these can be processed quickly, silently, and translated into a feeling. You may not know why you feel uneasy, but the feeling itself can guide you. In this way, intuition acts like a quiet assistant, always watching, always comparing, always suggesting, and most of the time, it serves us well. But there is another side to intuition, a softer truth. That is easy to overlook. That intuition is not designed to understand reality in a deep or accurate way. It is designed to help us survive, and sometimes those two goals are not the same. To see this more clearly, it helps to consider a few simple examples. Right now, wherever you are sitting or lying, it probably feels as though the ground beneath you is completely still, stable, unmoving. There is no sense that you're standing on a vast sphere, slowly turning through space. There is no feeling that you're moving at incredible speed, carried along by the rotation of the Earth and its orbit around the Sun. Instead, everything feels flat, still, at rest, and yet, we know that this feeling is not accurate. It is useful. It allows us to move, to balance, to live our daily lives without confusion. But it does not reflect the deeper structure of reality. In a similar way, time itself feels simple. Moments seem to flow, one after another, in a steady line. The past behind you, the future ahead. But when scientists studied time more carefully, they discovered something surprising. That time does not always move the same way, that it can stretch or compress, depending on motion and gravity. This is not something we need to calculate here, but you can imagine it gently, like this. If two clocks were placed in different conditions, one moving very fast, another resting quietly, they would not stay perfectly in sync. One would tick just slightly, differently than the other. Not because the clocks are broken, but because time itself behaves differently. And yet, none of this is visible in your daily experience. Your intuition tells you that time is steady, that space is simple, that the world behaves in obvious ways, and for most purposes, this is enough. But when we look more closely, we begin to see that intuition, while helpful, is not always reliable. It gives us a surface view, a simplified version, a kind of gentle illusion that allows us to function smoothly, and this brings us back to consciousness. Because here, perhaps more than anywhere else, we rely on intuition. We feel that we understand what consciousness is. We feel that we know what it means to be aware. We feel that we know where decisions come from and what it means to choose. But what if these feelings are also shaped by intuition? What if they are useful, but not entirely accurate? What if the very thing that feels most obvious is also the thing most in need of questioning? This is not to say that intuition is wrong, only that it may be incomplete, like seeing the surface of the ocean without knowing what moves beneath, and so a gentle shift begins to take place. Instead of asking only, what feels true, we begin to ask, what happens when we look more closely? What happens when we question the assumptions that seem too obvious to doubt? Because throughout the history of science, many of the greatest discoveries have begun in this way, with a quiet discomfort, a sense that something does not quite add up, and then, slowly, carefully, a willingness to let go of what felt certain and explore what might be true instead. As we continue, this process becomes a little more focused, because there are two particular assumptions that almost all of us carry without ever thinking about them. Two quiet beliefs that shape how we understand consciousness. They feel so natural, so self-evident, that we rarely question them. And yet, when we do, something interesting begins to happen. The ground shifts just slightly, and the mystery deepens in a way that is both unsettling and strangely beautiful. There are certain assumptions we carry so naturally that they feel almost invisible. We do not decide to believe them. We do not learn them in a formal way. They simply feel true. And when it comes to consciousness, there are two such assumptions that shape nearly everything we think. They sit quietly in the background, guiding our understanding without ever being questioned. The first is this: that we can recognize consciousness from the outside, and the second, that consciousness is what causes our actions. These ideas feel so obvious that they almost disappear. Of course, we can tell when someone is conscious. Of course, our feelings and thoughts influence what we do. It seems undeniable, but if we slow down just slightly and look more closely, both of these assumptions begin to soften. Let's begin with the first. Imagine you're meeting a friend after a long time. You see them walking toward you, smiling, their eyes bright with recognition. They call your name. They move with purpose, with emotion. Everything about the moment suggests, without question, that they are conscious. It feels immediate, certain. You do not stop to wonder, and in everyday life, this assumption works beautifully. We rely on it constantly. We connect with others. We communicate. We build relationships, all based on this quiet confidence. But now, let's gently shift the perspective. What exactly are you observing? You see movement, you hear sound, you notice expressions. All of these are external signs, patterns of behavior. But the experience itself, the inner feeling, is not directly visible. You're inferring it. You're making a very reasonable, very natural assumption. But it is still an assumption. There is no direct window into another mind. No way to step inside and confirm with absolute certainty what it feels like to be them. Even with someone you know deeply, someone you trust completely, their experience remains their own, hidden, private. And this is not a flaw. It is simply the nature of consciousness. It is known from within, but never fully accessible from the outside. Now, let's turn gently to the second assumption, that consciousness is what drives our behavior. This one feels even more immediate. You decide to stand up, and you stand. You feel hungry, and you eat. You think about something, and then you act. It seems as though your conscious experience is leading the way, like a guide, making choices, directing your actions. But here too, a subtle question begins to emerge. What if this feeling is not quite what it seems? What if consciousness is not the starting point, but something that arrives just a little later? To explore this, it helps to return to a simple moment. Imagine you're about to make a small decision, nothing dramatic, perhaps choosing whether to move your hand or remain still. If you watch closely, very gently, without forcing anything, you may notice something interesting. The decision does not feel like something you construct step by step. It feels like something that appears, a moment of clarity that simply arrives. Before that moment, there is uncertainty, and then, suddenly, there is a choice. It is as if the decision rises into awareness rather than being assembled there. Now, this is a subtle observation, and it can be easy to overlook, but it hints at something deeper, that the processes leading to a decision may begin before we become aware of them, that the brain may already be moving, already shaping outcomes, before the experience of choosing appears. This does not mean that consciousness is irrelevant, far from it, but it suggests that its role may be different from what we intuitively believe, not a commander issuing instructions, but perhaps something more like a narrator or a witness, gently observing what unfolds. Again, this is not a firm conclusion. It is an invitation to look more carefully, to notice that what feels obvious may not be as simple as it seems. And when we hold these two questions together, something begins to shift. If we cannot directly detect consciousness from the outside, and if it may not fully drive behavior, then the picture we have been relying on begins to loosen, not collapse, but soften, like a structure that is still standing, but no longer as rigid as before. And in that softening, there is space for new possibilities, for new ways of understanding, and perhaps a quiet sense of wonder. Because instead of having clear answers, we find ourselves with deeper questions. What is consciousness? If it is not fully visible and not fully in control, where does it fit in the unfolding of events? What role does it truly play? As we continue, these questions will guide us further, not in a straight line, but in gentle curves, like following a path that slowly reveals itself. And along that path, we will begin to encounter examples that challenge our assumptions even more directly. Moments where consciousness is clearly present, but completely hidden from view. And in those moments, the mystery becomes impossible to ignore. There is a natural habit we carry with us, almost everywhere we go. When we see movement, expression, communication, we assume there is experience behind it, and most of the time, this works beautifully. It allows us to connect with others, to understand one another, to move through the world with a sense of shared awareness. But there are rare situations where this assumption begins to break, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, deeply unsettling way. Imagine a person lying still in a hospital bed, their eyes open, but their body unmoving. No speech, no gestures, no visible response. From the outside, it may appear as though nothing is happening, as though the person is no longer aware, and yet, in some cases, something very different is true. There is a condition known as locked-in syndrome. In this state, the brain remains active and consciousness is still present. The person can see, they can hear, they can think. They may even be fully aware of everything around them, but their body no longer responds, almost completely paralyzed, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to signal in the usual ways. From the outside, there is silence, but on the inside, there may be a full, vivid experience, a life continuing, quietly, unseen. There's a story that illustrates this in a very human way. A man who suffered a stroke and found himself in this condition. At first, no one realised he was conscious. Days passed, then longer, until someone noticed a small movement, a single eyelid able to blink, and through that one small movement, a bridge was formed. Slowly, carefully, he began to communicate, letter by letter, word by word. Eventually he was able to write an entire book, not with his hands, but with a careful rhythm of blinking, a full mind, hidden inside a still body. This kind of situation changes something very deeply, because it shows us, in the clearest possible way, that behaviour is not the same as consciousness, that the absence of movement does not mean the absence of experience, and once you see this, it becomes difficult to ignore, because it raises a quiet question: if consciousness can be present without any visible sign, how often might we be mistaken? How often do we rely on external signals to judge something that is fundamentally internal? This question does not have an easy answer, but it gently loosens one of our strongest intuitions, that we can always tell when consciousness is there. There is also another example, less extreme, but equally revealing. It is possible in rare cases for someone under anesthesia to have a brief moment of awareness without being able to move or respond. From the outside, everything appears normal. The body remains still. The procedure continues, but inside there is a fleeting experience, a moment of awareness, with no way to communicate it, and afterward it may be remembered. Again, this is not common, but it is enough to show something important, that consciousness can exist, even when the usual signs are absent, and so the picture becomes more complex, more uncertain, more subtle. We begin to see that consciousness is not something we can point to directly, not something we can measure in the same way we measure temperature or distance. We can observe the brain, we can detect activity, we can notice patterns, but the experience itself remains hidden, always just out of reach from the outside. This does not make consciousness mysterious in a distant way. It makes it mysterious in a very close way, because the only place it is fully known is from within. You know your own experience directly, without doubt, without inference. But the experience of another is something you can only imagine, something you infer from behaviour, from expression, from communication, and usually that inference is accurate, but not always, and this small gap between what is seen and what is felt is where the mystery quietly lives. It also invites a different kind of awareness, a softer way of looking at the world, because if we cannot fully know the inner experience of others, then there is always a layer of uncertainty, a hidden depth beneath what we observe. Every person you pass, every voice you hear, carries an inner world that cannot be directly accessed, and perhaps even beyond human beings. This question extends further, to other forms of life, to systems that behave in ways we do not fully understand. If behaviour alone is not enough to confirm consciousness, then how do we draw the boundary? Where does experience begin, and where does it end? These are not questions with immediate answers, but they open something, a sense that consciousness is more private, more subtle, and perhaps more widespread than we once assumed. And as we sit with this, another realization begins to take shape, that not only might consciousness be hidden from the outside, but even within ourselves, what we feel may not fully reflect what is happening beneath the surface. that our own experience may arrive later than we think, that the sense of now may be something gently constructed rather than something immediate. And as we begin to explore that idea, the mystery takes another quiet step deeper. There is a quiet assumption that sits at the centre of how we experience our lives, a feeling so natural that we rarely pause to question it, that we are the ones making our decisions, that when we act, it is because we have chosen to act. It feels immediate. You decide to move your hand, and it moves. You choose what to say, and the words follow. You feel something, and then you respond. It all seems to unfold in a simple, familiar order. First, the decision, then the action. But if we slow this down just slightly and look more closely, a different picture begins to emerge. Let's begin with something very simple. Imagine that you're about to move, not yet, just preparing. You could lift your hand, or shift your foot, or remain completely still. Now, instead of rushing, wait. Let the moment stretch, just a little. And then, at some point, a decision appears. You move. But if you pay close attention, you may notice something subtle. The moment of deciding does not feel like something you build. It does not unfold step by step, like assembling an object. Instead, it feels as though it arrives, a quiet shift from uncertainty to action, almost like a thought that simply appears in your mind. This alone might not seem surprising, but it becomes more interesting and when we look beneath the surface, because the brain is always active. Even before you become aware of making a decision, there are processes already unfolding, signals moving, patterns forming, possibilities narrowing, and by the time the decision enters your awareness, much of this work may already be complete. This does not mean that your experience is false, but it suggests that it may not be the starting point. It may be part of the process, but not the beginning of it. To see this more clearly, it helps to look at something even more familiar, the feeling of fear. Imagine you are walking and suddenly something unexpected happens, a loud sound, a sudden movement. Before you have time to think, your body reacts, your heart quickens, your muscles tense, your attention sharpens. Only a moment later, you become aware of the feeling. You notice, I am afraid. But by that time, the response has already begun. The body has already moved. The system has already shifted. The experience of fear arrives slightly after the reaction itself, like an echo following a sound. This timing difference is very small, almost impossible to notice in everyday life, but it reveals something important, that the processes shaping your actions may begin before you are aware of them, and that awareness may come just a little later. There is another gentle example that helps bring this into focus. Imagine pressing a key on a piano. You feel the movement of your finger. You hear the sound of the note. You see the key move downward. All of this seems to happen at the same time, a single moment. But in reality, these signals travel in different ways. The sound takes time to reach your ears. The light takes time to reach your eyes. The sensation travels through your body at its own pace. Each signal arrives at the brain at slightly different moments, and yet your experience combines them into one seamless event, a single, unified now. This suggests something subtle, that the present moment is not simply received, but gently assembled, woven together from signals that arrive at different times. And if this is true for perception, it may also be true for action. The feeling of deciding, the sense of choosing, may be part of this same construction. Not the origin, but the appearance. Not the cause, but the experience. Again, this does not mean that your choices are meaningless, or that your actions are not your own. It simply invites a softer view that the process of deciding is maybe deeper, more layered than it feels from the inside, that what you experience as I decided may be the moment when the decision becomes visible rather than the moment it begins. And this can feel slightly disorienting because it gently shifts the sense of control from something immediate and direct to something more subtle, more distributed, more hidden. But there is also something quietly reassuring here, because it suggests that your mind is constantly working in ways you do not need to manage, that countless processes are unfolding, helping you respond, adapt, navigate, without requiring your constant attention, like a system quietly supporting you beneath the surface. And your conscious experience just becomes a kind of window into that system, a way of noticing what has already begun. As we continue, this realization begins to deepen, because if decisions arise, rather than being constructed by a central self, then we may need to look more closely at that self itself. What is it that we feel is making these choices? Where is it located? Is it as solid as it seems? Or is it something more fluid, more dynamic, more like a pattern than a thing? And as we turn toward that question, the familiar sense of I begins to soften in a way that is both subtle and profound. There is a feeling so familiar that it rarely draws attention to itself, a quiet sense of being someone, not just experiencing the world, but being a person within it, a self. It feels stable, continuous, centered somewhere, just behind your eyes, or within your body. You wake up in the morning, and it is still there. You move through the day, and it seems to remain the same. You have a name, a history, memories that stretch backward, and expectations that reach forward. All of this comes together into the sense that there is a you, a single entity, moving through time, and in many ways, this makes perfect sense. There are patterns in your behavior, preferences, habits, ways of thinking, ways of reacting that give your life a certain continuity. In this sense, we can speak of a self quite naturally, just as we can speak of a river, or a cloud, or a wave. But if we look a little more closely, something begins to shift. Because while the idea of a self is useful, the experience of being a fixed, unchanging entity may not be as solid as it seems. To explore this, it helps to consider a simple comparison. Imagine a rock. A rock is stable, it holds its shape, it remains more or less the same over time. Now imagine a wave in the ocean. At first glance, as we might say, that is a wave. We can point to it, we can describe it. But if we look more carefully, we notice something different. The wave is not a single fixed thing. It is a pattern. Water is constantly moving through it, rising, falling, shifting. The shape appears, and then dissolves, only to form again. The wave exists, but not as a solid object. It exists as a process, and in many ways, the self is more like the wave than the rock. Your thoughts are always changing. Your sensations come and go. Your emotions rise and fade. Even your body is constantly renewing itself at a microscopic level. And yet, through all of this change, there is a sense of continuity, a feeling that it is all happening to the same you. This feeling is powerful, so powerful that it creates the impression of something stable, something that remains unchanged through the flow of time. But what if that impression is not entirely accurate? What if the self is not a fixed entity, but a dynamic process, continuously being constructed? To begin to see this, you could try a very gentle observation. Notice your thoughts, not their content, but their movement. A thought appears, lingers for a moment, and then fades. Another follows, and another. There is no single thought that stays, no fixed centre from which they all emerge. Instead, there is a flow, a constant unfolding, and the same is true for sensations. A feeling in your hand comes into awareness and then disappears. A sound arises and then dissolves into silence. Even your sense of being located in your bodies can shift. Sometimes it feels centered in your head, sometimes more spread out, sometimes barely noticed at all. And yet, despite all this movement, there's still a sense of I, a quiet feeling that all of this is happening to someone. But where is that someone? If you look for it, not conceptually, but directly, it becomes difficult to find. You may find thoughts, but they are changing. You may find sensations, but they are moving. You may find memories, but they belong to the past. The self seems to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. This does not mean that the self is an illusion in the sense of being meaningless. It means something more subtle, that the self is not what it appears to be. It is not a fixed object, sitting somewhere inside you. It is more like a story, continuously being told, a narrative built from memory, from perception, from expectation. And like any story, it has structure, it has coherence, but it is still something that unfolds, moment by moment. There is also another layer to this, the sense that the self is separate from the world, that there is you, here, and everything else, out there. This boundary feels clear, defined, but even this begins to soften when we look more closely. Every moment, you're in constant exchange with your environment. You breathe in air and breathe it out again. You take in sounds, light, information. Your body responds, adjusts, adapts. There's a continuous interaction between what you call you and what you call the world, and yet we experience this as separation, as if there is a clear line dividing one from the other. This too may be part of the same construction, a useful way of organizing experience, but not a perfect reflection of reality. As we sit with this idea, the sense of self does not disappear. It remains, but it becomes lighter, less rigid, more fluid, like a pattern that is constantly forming and dissolving within the larger flow of experience. And this opens the door to a different way of seeing, not as a fixed observer, separate from everything, but as a process within everything, a movement within a larger movement. And as we continue, this perspective begins to deepen, because there are moments when this sense of self can grow very quiet, moments where the boundary softens and something more open, more spacious begins to appear. And in those moments, experience remains, even when the sense of I fades into the background. Time equals, quote, 3 seconds, quote / greater than, as the sense of self begins to soften. Another layer of understanding slowly comes into view, not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet shift in perspective. If the self is not a fixed thing, if it is more like a pattern, a story, a movement, then what we are left with is something more fluid, more open, less like an object, and more like a process. This word, process, may sound abstract at first, but it points to something very simple, something we already experience all the time. A process is not something that exists all at once. It unfolds, it changes, it moves, like the flowing of a river. At any given moment, you can point to the river and say, there it is. And yet, the water is constantly moving. What you're pointing to is not a fixed thing, but an ongoing activity, a pattern that continues, even as its parts are always changing. In the same way, your experience is not something static. It is not a single state that remains unchanged. It is a continuous unfolding, each moment giving way to the next, each sensation appearing and then fading, each thought forming and then dissolving. And within this flow, the sense of self arises, not as a permanent centre, but as something that is continuously constructed, moment by moment. There's a subtle illusion that often accompanies this process, the feeling that there is a stable observer somewhere inside, watching everything happen, a kind of inner point from which all experience is viewed. It may feel as though it is located behind your eyes or somewhere in the centre of your head, a place where you reside. But if you look for this observer carefully, gently, it becomes difficult to find. You may notice thoughts, but they are not the observer. You may notice sensations, but they are not the observer either. Even the feeling of being here is itself something that appears within experience, not something separate from it. And so, the idea of a central point begins to loosen, not disappear completely, but soften, like a shape that was once sharp, now becoming blurred at the edges. This is where the idea of process becomes especially helpful, because it allows us to see that there may not be a single centre, but rather a collection of interactions, a network of activity, constantly shifting, constantly reorganising. Imagine a group of people in conversation. There is no single voice controlling everything. Instead, the conversation emerges from the interaction between them. Voices overlap, respond, adjust, and from this dynamic exchange, a shared experience takes shape. In a similar way, the brain can be seen as a vast network of interactions, signals moving, patterns forming, connections strengthening and weakening. There is no single place where you are located. Instead, there is a distributed process, giving rise to the sense of being someone. This also helps explain something we touched on earlier, the boundary between self and world. It feels clear. You are here, the world is out there. But if the self is a process, then this boundary becomes less rigid, because processes do not have sharp edges. They blend, they interact, they depend on what is around them. Every moment, you're exchanging information with your environment. Light enters your eyes, sound reaches your ears, air moves in and out of your body. Your internal state shifts in response to what is outside, and your actions, in turn, affect the world around you. It is a continuous loop, a flow of influence, moving in both directions. And within this flow, the sense of inside and outside begins to feel less absolute, more like a useful distinction than a fundamental divide. This does not mean that the boundary disappears entirely. It simply becomes more flexible, more contextual, more dependent on how we look at it. There is also something quietly freeing in this perspective, because if the self is not a fixed thing, then it is not something that must remain the same. It is not something that needs to be held tightly or defended. It is something that evolves, that adapts, that shifts over time like a pattern, learning, adjusting, becoming. And this can change the way we relate to our own experience. Thoughts may arise, but they do not define a permanent self. Emotions may move through, but they are part of the process. not the whole of it. Even identity becomes something more open, less rigid, more fluid, and as this understanding deepens, another possibility begins to appear, that perhaps the sense of being a separate self is not always present, that there may be moments when this process continues, but the feeling of a central I quietly fades, moments when experience remains, but the sense of ownership becomes less defined, less pronounced, and in those moments, something interesting happens. Not confusion, not loss, but a kind of openness, a sense of being without needing to be someone. And as we gently move toward that idea, we begin to explore what happens when the self grows quiet and what remains when it does. There are moments, quiet ones, that you may have already experienced without naming them. Moments when the usual sense of being a separate someone begins to soften, not disappear completely, but fade into the background, like a sound that slowly becomes less noticeable. Perhaps you have felt this while listening to music, not thinking about the song, not analysing it, but simply being with it. The melody unfolds, the rhythm carries you, and for a while, there is no strong sense of you listening. There is just the experience. Or maybe it happens when you're deeply focused, working on something that absorbs your attention, a task that draws you in completely. Time seems to pass differently. The usual stream of thoughts quiets down, and the sense of being a separate observer, watching everything from a distance, becomes less pronounced. You're still there, of course, but not in the same way, not as a solid centre, more as a presence within the activity itself. These are often called moments of flow, times when action and awareness seem to blend together. There is no need to constantly reflect, no need to narrate what is happening. Things simply unfold, smoothly, naturally. And in those moments, something subtle is revealed, that the sense of self is not always required for experience to continue. There can be seeing without a strong sense of someone seeing. There can be hearing without a clear feeling of someone listening. There can be doing without the constant presence of someone doing. This may feel unusual at first, because we are so accustomed to identifying with that sense of self. It feels like the center of everything. But when it quiets, experience does not disappear. It remains clear, present, unfolding. There are also practices that gently explore this more intentionally. One example is meditation, not as a rigid technique, but as a simple act of paying attention. Often, this involves noticing the present moment, just as it is. The sensation of breathing, the sounds around you, the subtle movements of the mind, and as attention becomes steadier, something interesting begins to happen. The usual patterns of thought begin to slow. The constant narration, the quiet voice that comments on everything, begins to soften, and with that, the sense of a solid self often becomes less defined. Some people describe this as a feeling of openness, others as a sense of unity, a dissolving of boundaries, a quiet connection with everything around them. These descriptions vary, but they point to a similar shift. A reduction in the feeling of separation. Now, there is a part of the brain, often associated with self-referential thinking, that tends to be more active when we are thinking about ourselves, about our past, our future, our identity. When this activity is strong, the sense of self becomes more vivid, more defined. But when it quiets, during moments of deep focus or meditation, the experience changes. not because something new is added, but because something familiar has become less dominant, and what remains is simply experience itself, without the usual layer of interpretation, without the constant reference back to me. This does not mean that the self is gone in any permanent way. It can return easily, naturally, like a familiar shape, reforming when needed. But it does show us something important, that the self is not always present in the way we assume, that it can fade without disrupting the flow of experience. And this reveals something deeper about consciousness, that it's not dependent on the presence of a strong identity, that awareness can continue even when the sense of I becomes quiet. There's also a gentle shift that can occur when this is noticed, a softening of the need to hold on to the self as something fixed, a recognition that it is something that arises and fades, like many other aspects of experience. And this can bring a certain lightness, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, steady sense, that you do not need to maintain a constant narrative in order to be present, that you can simply be without needing to define exactly who that you is in every moment. This is not about losing yourself. It is about seeing more clearly how the sense of self is formed and how it can gently step aside without anything essential being lost. As we continue, this understanding begins to connect with something we explored earlier, the idea that decisions may not originate from a central controller, that they may arise as from processes unfolding beneath awareness. And now, with the self becoming more fluid, that idea begins to take on a new shape. Because if there is no fixed center, no solid decider, then what we call control may also be something that feels different than it actually is. And as we move into that question, we begin to explore the sense of choice itself, not as something to accept or reject, but as something to understand more gently, more deeply. There is a feeling so familiar, so woven into everyday life, that it almost goes unnoticed. The feeling that you are the one choosing what happens next. It appears in small moments and large ones alike. You reach for a glass of water and it feels as though you chose to move your hand. You decide what to say in a conversation and it feels as though the words came from you, guided by your intention. Even now as you listen, it may feel as though you're choosing to stay, choosing to continue. This feeling is quiet but powerful. It gives a sense of authorship, a sense that your actions belong to you in a direct and immediate way. It feels as though, at any given moment, things could have gone differently, that you could have chosen another path, another word, another movement. And because this feeling is so consistent, so reliable, it becomes one of the foundations of how we understand ourselves. But rather than rushing to question it, it helps to stay with it for a moment, to notice what it actually feels like. Not as an abstract idea, but as a lived experience. Perhaps you can recall a recent decision, something simple. Choosing what to eat or whether to respond to a message, or deciding to adjust your position as you sit or lie down. In that moment, there was likely a subtle sense of weighing possibilities, a quiet leaning toward one option over another. And then, at some point, the decision seemed to settle. It became clear and action followed. From the inside, this process feels smooth, continuous, almost seamless. There is no obvious gap, no visible mechanism. It simply feels like I decided. And this feeling carries a kind of certainty with it, not in a logical sense, but in a direct, immediate sense. It feels obvious that you are the source of your actions. Yet, if we look just a little more closely, something interesting begins to emerge. Not contradiction, but a softening of that certainty. Because the feeling of choosing and the process of choosing may not be exactly the same thing. One is what it feels like from the inside. The other is what is happening beneath the surface within the quiet activity of the brain. And here it can help to shift perspective slightly. Instead of asking, "Am I choosing?" we can ask, "What does choosing actually involve?" When a decision unfolds, there are many influences at play: memories, preferences, habits, emotional states, subtle cues from the environment, all interacting in ways that are too complex to track in real time. It is not a single event, but a process, unfolding across many layers at once. You might imagine this process like a landscape of possibilities. At first, there are many directions you could take, but as different factors come into play, your past experiences, your current mood, the context you're in, some possibilities begin to feel more likely than others. The landscape gently reshapes itself, narrowing, guiding, leaning, until one path becomes clear enough to follow. And when that moment arrives, when the decision becomes conscious, it feels as though it has been chosen. But the path toward it may have been forming quietly, long before it entered awareness. This does not remove the feeling of choice, it simply places it within a larger process. There is also something subtle about the feeling that things could have been otherwise. It feels as though, if you rewind the moment, you might choose differently. And in a sense, this feeling is meaningful. It reflects the openness of possibilities as we experience them. But it does not necessarily mean that the underlying process was free from all conditions. It may be that given the exact same situation, the same internal state, the same influences, the outcome would unfold in the same way, and yet from the inside it does not feel that way. It feels open, flexible, responsive, and this feeling is not an error. It is part of how we navigate the world. It allows us to reflect, to consider, to adjust our behaviour over time. It gives us a sense of participation, of being involved in what unfolds. So rather than seeing this as a contradiction, it can be seen as two perspectives layered together. From the inside, there is the lived experience of choosing, immediate, intuitive, meaningful. From the outside, there is a complex process, unfolding across time, shaped by countless interacting factors. And both perspectives have their place. There is also a gentle shift that can happen when we begin to notice this. A softening of the need to control every detail, a recognition that much of what guides our actions is already in motion. This does not remove responsibility, or meaning, or care. Instead, it can bring a kind of quiet ease, a sense that you are part of a larger flow, rather than standing apart from it. You still act, you still respond, you still make choices in the way they appear to you, but there is less tension around needing to be the sole origin of everything, less pressure to hold everything together, and as this perspective settles, another question begins to arise, almost naturally. If the feeling of choosing is part of a larger process, if decisions seem to appear rather than being constructed step by step, then what is the role of the self within this? Is there a central point where all of this is directed, or is it something more distributed, more fluid? These questions do not demand immediate answers. They simply invite a deeper look, a more careful noticing of how experience unfolds. And as we continue, that noticing will begin to reveal something even more subtle, that the sense of being the one who decides may itself be part of the experience, rather than the source behind it. As the feeling of choosing becomes a little softer, a little more open to observation, there is a natural next step. Not to replace that feeling, but to look at it more closely, almost as if you were watching it unfold in slow motion. You might try a very simple experiment one that requires no special setup, no equipment, just a quiet moment of attention. As you listen, you could choose to move a part of your body, perhaps a finger or your foot. Not yet. Just hold the possibility in mind. There are several options available to you, and for a brief moment none has been selected. Then, at some point, without forcing it, a movement happens. If you pay attention to that moment, something interesting may be noticed. The decision does not seem to arrive as a carefully constructed sequence. It does not feel like you are assembling it piece by piece, like building something from the ground up. Instead, it often feels as though it appears, as if the intention comes into view, already formed, and then the action follows. This can be subtle, easy to miss, but once seen, even faintly, it raises a quiet question. If the decision feels like it appears, where does it come from? In scientific studies, researchers have explored this question by observing brain activity during simple decisions. Without going into numbers or measurements, the general finding is this: patterns in the brain that relate to movement can begin to form before a person becomes aware of deciding to move. In other words, the process leading to the action may already be underway, quietly unfolding before the conscious experience of "I am about to move" arises. This does not mean that consciousness is absent. It means that it may not be the starting point we intuitively assume. The experience of deciding may be more like the moment when the process becomes visible, rather than the moment it begins. You can think of it like watching a wave approach the shore. From a distance, the water is already moving, shaped by forces that began far away. But you only clearly notice the wave when it rises into view, when it becomes distinct against the surface. The movement did not begin at that moment, but that is when it becomes part of your experience. In a similar way, decisions may be forming beneath the surface of awareness shaped by many influences: your past experiences, your current state, subtle signals you may not even notice. And then, at some point, the result of this process enters consciousness, appearing as a decision. There is also something important about how this feels from the inside. Even if the process begins before awareness, the experience of deciding is still real. It is still part of your life, part of how you understand your actions. But it may not be the full story, only the visible part. Another gentle way to see this is to notice how thoughts themselves appear. You do not usually decide your next thought in advance. It arrives. A memory surfaces, an idea forms, a word comes to mind, and only after it appears do you become aware of it. Decisions may follow a similar pattern, arising within the flow of mental activity rather than being constructed by a central point. This can feel slightly unfamiliar, perhaps even unsettling at first, because it shifts the sense of control, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet one. Instead of being the sole origin of every action, you begin to see yourself as part of a process, one that is already in motion. But there is also something quietly reassuring in this. It suggests that much of what guides your behavior is already being handled, already unfolding with a kind of intelligence that does not require constant supervision. Your mind is not waiting for a command at every moment. It is continuously processing, adjusting, responding. And your awareness becomes a window into that process, a way of noticing what has emerged, what has taken shape. This does not remove meaning from your actions. It does not make them random or disconnected. It simply places them within a larger context, one that includes both conscious experience and underlying activity. There is also a subtle shift in how we might understand responsibility. If decisions emerge from a complex interaction of factors, then responsibility is not about a single moment of choice, isolated from everything else. It becomes something more distributed, connected to patterns of behavior over time, to learning, to reflection, to change. And this brings a certain gentleness to the idea of control, not a loss of agency, but a recognition that agency itself may be more layered than it appears. You still participate, you still respond, you still shape your actions, but you do so as part of an ongoing process, rather than from a single fixed point. As this understanding settles even slightly, another question begins to arise, one that connects back to what we explored earlier about the self. If decisions emerge, and if there is no clear moment where a central decider creates them from nothing, then what is this sense of being the one who decides? Is it a separate entity standing behind the process? Or is it itself part of the experience? Another pattern within consciousness, giving shape to how events are understood. This question does not need to be answered immediately. It can simply be held gently as something to explore. And as we move forward, we will begin to see how the idea of control can shift, not disappearing, but becoming something more subtle, more flexible, more connected to the flow of experience itself. As the idea of decision-making becomes a little less solid, a little less centered around a single point, it is natural for a quiet concern to arise. If choices seem to emerge, if there is no clear moment where everything is consciously created, then what happens to freedom? What happens to the sense that your life is your own, that your actions matter, that you're not simply being carried along by forces you do not control? These are important questions, and rather than answering them quickly, it helps to approach them slowly, with care. Because the goal here is not to take something away, but to see it more clearly. To begin, it is helpful to notice that the feeling of freedom does not come only from being the absolute origin of every action. It comes from something more immediate, from the ability to respond, to adapt, to reflect, and to change over time. Even if decisions emerge from a deeper process, that process includes everything that you are, your experiences, your memories, your values, your understanding. All of these shape how decisions unfold, so when a choice appears, it is not separate from you. It is an expression of everything that has come together in that moment. In this sense, freedom may not be about standing outside the process, controlling it from above. It may be about being part of the process in a way that is responsive, flexible, alive. You might imagine this like a conversation. You do not plan every word in advance. You do not construct each sentence step by step before speaking. Instead, you listen, you respond, you adjust. The conversation unfolds through interaction, and yet you still feel that you are participating, that your voice matters, that what you say has meaning. Your words are not random, they're shaped by who you are and by what is happening in that moment. In a similar way, your actions may arise from a complex interaction of influences, but they are still connected to you. They still reflect your patterns, your tendencies, your way of being. There is also something important about how change happens. Even if decisions are not consciously constructed from nothing, your awareness can still play a role. By noticing patterns, by reflecting on outcomes, by learning from experience, the process itself can shift. Over time, your responses can become different, more aligned with what you care about, more consistent with your intentions. This is a kind of freedom, but not the kind that comes from complete control. It is a freedom that grows from participation, from adaptation, from being part of an evolving system. There's also a gentle relief that can come with this perspective, because the idea of needing to control everything, to be the sole source of every action, can carry a quiet tension, a sense of pressure, a feeling that everything depends entirely on you in a very direct and immediate way. But if actions are part of a larger unfolding, if they arise from processes that include more than conscious awareness, then that pressure can begin to soften, not disappear, but ease. You're still involved, but not alone in the process. There is support, structure, a kind of underlying movement that carries things forward, and this can create a different relationship with experience, one that is less about forcing and more about allowing, less about controlling every detail and more about responding with clarity when things arise. This does not mean passivity. It does not mean doing nothing. It means recognizing that action does not need to begin from a place of strain. It can emerge naturally from the conditions that are already present, and when this is seen, even slightly, a new kind of freedom becomes possible. Not the freedom of complete independence from all causes, but the freedom of being deeply connected to them, of moving within the flow, with awareness, with sensitivity, with care. There is also something quietly grounding in this, because it places you within the world rather than apart from it. You're not a separate controller, standing outside the system. You are part of the system itself, shaped by it, and shaping it in return. And within this relationship, meaning does not disappear. If anything, it deepens. Because your actions are not isolated events. They are part of a larger pattern, connected to everything that has come before and everything that will follow. As this understanding settles, another shift begins to take place, a widening of perspective. Because if the processes that shape your decisions are not entirely conscious and not entirely centralized, then it raises a broader question. Are these kinds of processes unique to human beings, or do they appear in different forms throughout nature? Are there simpler systems that show signs of responding, adapting, making choices in their own way? And if so, what does that suggest about the nature of consciousness itself? As we gently turn toward that question, the focus begins to expand, beyond the human mind into the wider world, where patterns of behavior and traces of responsiveness can be found in places we might not have expected. As the sense of control becomes softer, less tied to a single point, the question begins to widen, almost on its own, not in a dramatic leap, but in a quiet expansion. If the processes that shape your decisions are not entirely conscious and not entirely centralized, then perhaps they are not entirely unique either. Perhaps something like this, in a simpler form, appears elsewhere in nature. At first, this idea may feel unusual, because we are used to associating decision-making with brains, with thoughts, with complex nervous systems. But if we look more gently, more patiently, we begin to notice patterns that do not fit so neatly into that expectation. Consider something as simple as a plant, rooted in the soil, silent, unmoving in the way animals move, and yet not inactive. Beneath the surface, roots extend through the ground, slowly exploring, adjusting their direction, growing toward areas where water is more likely to be found. This is not random growth. It is responsive, sensitive to subtle gradients in moisture, to differences in the surrounding environment. In a way that feels surprisingly familiar, the plant is choosing a direction, not in the sense of a conscious thought, but as a process that selects, that adapts, that leans toward what supports its survival. There are also climbing plants, vines that reach outward, searching for structures to hold on to. They do not move quickly, but over time, their movement reveals something remarkable. They sense light. They respond to touch. They adjust their growth depending on what they encounter. If a support is nearby, the vine curves toward it, wrapping gently, stabilizing itself. If the support is removed, the pattern changes, the direction shifts again. It is a slow form of interaction, but it is still interaction. Still a kind of responsiveness that unfolds without a central controller, without a brain as we understand it. And when we observe this, not as something mechanical, but as something dynamic, something adjusting moment by moment, it begins to feel less like a rigid system and more like a process that resembles, in its own quiet way, the patterns we see in ourselves. Even at a smaller scale, there are systems that behave in ways that suggest a kind of sensitivity, a kind of selection. Single-celled organisms, for example, can move toward nutrients and away from harmful conditions. They do not think, they do not plan, and yet they respond. Their behavior changes depending on what is present in their environment. It is not necessary to say that these systems are conscious in the same way we are. That would be too strong, too certain. But it does raise a gentle question. What exactly is required for something to have even the faintest trace of experience? Is a brain necessary, or is it one possible way, among many, for processes of responsiveness to become more complex? This question does not need to be answered directly. It can simply be allowed to remain open, because what matters here is the shift in perspective. Instead of seeing intelligence, decision-making, responsiveness as something that suddenly appears in humans, fully formed, we begin to see it as something that may exist along a spectrum, from very simple interactions to the rich, layered experiences we are familiar with. And along that spectrum, there may be many forms, many expressions that do not resemble our own, but still carry a faint echo of the same underlying pattern, a process that senses, that responds, that adapts over time. There is also something quietly humbling in this realization, because it suggests that the qualities we often associate with ourselves may not be as exclusive as we once believed. Not identical, not equal in complexity, but not entirely separate either. The boundary between thinking systems and non-thinking systems begins to blur, just slightly, like a line drawn in sand, softened by the movement of water. And when that boundary softens, even a little, the world begins to feel different. Not in a way that demands a conclusion, but in a way that invites curiosity. The tree outside, the soil beneath it, the small forms of life moving unseen, all become part of a larger web of processes, interacting, influencing, shaping one another in ways that are often invisible but no less real. This does not mean that everything is conscious, or that every process contains experience. Those are much deeper questions, but it does suggest that the ingredients we associate with consciousness, responsiveness, integration, adaptation, may be more widely distributed than we once assumed. And if that is the case, then the question of consciousness itself begins to expand. It is no longer only about the human mind, or even the animal mind. It becomes a question about the nature of systems, about how complexity arises, about how patterns of interaction give rise to something that, at some point, becomes experience. As this perspective settles, slowly, gently, it prepares the ground for one of the most intriguing possibilities in this entire exploration. If consciousness exists, at least in us, then it cannot be completely absent from reality. It must, in some way, be possible. And if it is possible, then we are left with a quiet fork in the road, not a sharp division, but a soft branching of ideas. Either consciousness appears only in certain kinds of systems under very specific conditions, or it is something more fundamental, something that, in its simplest form, is woven into the fabric of reality itself. This is not a conclusion, not something to accept or reject, but a direction, a way of looking that opens into a deeper kind of wonder. And as we follow that direction, carefully, without rushing, we begin to explore what it might mean if consciousness is not just something that emerges, but something that has been present in some form all along. As the perspective gently widens, the question becomes both simpler and deeper at the same time, not more complicated, but more fundamental. If consciousness exists at all, even in a single instance, even right here, as you listen, then it cannot be completely absent from reality. It must, in some sense, be possible, and once that is acknowledged, even softly, a quiet branching of ideas begins to appear, not as a sharp division, but as two gentle directions the mind can follow. On one side, the idea that consciousness arises only in certain systems, under very specific conditions, perhaps when complexity reaches a particular threshold, when enough connections form, when information flows in a certain way. Then, and only then, experience appears. On the other side, a different possibility, that consciousness in its simplest form is not something that suddenly appears, but something that is already present, quietly, in a more basic way, and becomes richer, more structured, as systems become more complex. These two directions can be held very lightly, not as conclusions, but as ways of looking. The first feels familiar. It aligns with the idea that the universe begins as something purely physical, and that at some point, under the right conditions, experience emerges, like a flame that appears when the ingredients are just right. The second feels more unusual, but also strangely simple. It suggests that the ingredients for experience are not added later, but are there from the beginning, in a minimal, almost imperceptible form, and what we call consciousness is the unfolding of that potential into more complex patterns. You might imagine this difference in a very gentle way, like looking at light. One way to think about light is as something that turns on. When a switch is pressed, it appears suddenly, where before there was darkness. Another way is to imagine that light is always present, but in different intensities. Sometimes so faint that it is barely noticeable, and sometimes bright enough to illuminate everything clearly. In this second view, the difference is not between having light and not having light, but between different degrees of brightness, different levels of expression. In a similar way, the question becomes, is consciousness like a switch that turns on only in certain systems, or is it more like a dim glow, present in a very subtle way, and gradually becoming more vivid as systems become more complex? There is no immediate answer, and perhaps there does not need to be, because what matters is the shift in how the question is framed. Instead of asking only where consciousness begins, we begin to ask how it might vary, how it might scale, how it might take on different forms across different kinds of systems. There is also a quiet logical step that often goes unnoticed. If we are certain that consciousness exists somewhere, then we're already accepting that the universe allows for experience. It is not something outside reality, it is part of it. And once that is accepted, even in the smallest way, it becomes difficult to draw a clear line between where experience is possible and where it is not. Any line we draw tends to feel somewhat arbitrary, a boundary placed for convenience, rather than something clearly defined by nature itself. This does not mean that everything is conscious in the same way. or that all systems have rich inner lives. Far from it. The differences between systems can be vast, just as the difference between a faint flicker and a bright flame can be immense. But it does open the possibility that consciousness is not an all or nothing phenomenon, not something that suddenly appears fully formed, but something that may exist along a continuum, from the simplest traces to the complex layered experiences we know so well. There is something quietly elegant in this idea, not because it provides a final answer, but because it removes the need for a sudden jump, a moment where something entirely new appears out of nothing. Instead, it suggests a gradual unfolding, a deepening of patterns, a growing richness of interaction, until, at some point, experience becomes vivid enough to recognize clearly. And yet, even as this idea settles, it remains important to hold it gently. It is not a conclusion that must be accepted. It is one of several ways of looking, a perspective that opens certain possibilities while leaving others still unknown. The goal here is not to decide, but to explore, to notice how each possibility changes the way we see the world and our place within it. Because if consciousness is limited to certain systems, then understanding those systems becomes the key to understanding experience. But if consciousness is more fundamental, more widely distributed, then the question shifts again. It becomes less about where it begins, and more about how it is expressed, how it organizes itself, how it becomes the rich, detailed awareness we experience as our own lives. And in that shift, something subtle happens. The boundary between the observer and the observed, between the one who experiences and the world that is experienced, begins to soften, not disappear entirely, but become less rigid, less absolute. The world is no longer just something out there, separate and distinct. It becomes part of a larger pattern, within which experience itself is unfolding. This does not need to be resolved. It does not need to be defined with precision. It can remain as a quiet possibility, something to hold gently, like a thought that lingers without needing to be completed. And as we rest with that possibility, another question begins to arise. Not about what consciousness is, or where it comes from, but about what it might become. If our understanding of consciousness continues to deepen, if our ability to explore it grows, then the way we relate to it may also begin to change, not only in theory, but in experience itself. And this opens the door to a different kind of science, one that does not only observe from the outside, but begins to explore what it means to share, to connect, to understand experience in ways that were once unimaginable. And as we move gently in that direction, the story begins to shift once more, from what is to what might be, from the quiet mysteries of the present to the unfolding possibilities of the future. As the question of consciousness expands, not just as something we experience, but as something that might be more deeply woven into reality, it quietly opens the door to another possibility, one that feels almost like science fiction at first, and yet is slowly beginning to take shape at the edges of science itself. Not a sudden leap, but a gradual shift in how we think about understanding experience. For a long time, science has approached the mind from the outside. It observes behavior, measures brain activity, tracks patterns, and builds models based on what can be seen and recorded. This approach has brought us incredibly far, revealing the structure of the brain, the dynamics of neural activity, the ways in which information flows and transforms. But throughout all of this, one limitation has remained constant: experience itself. The feeling of being has always been private. You can describe what you see, Explain what you hear, share your thoughts in words, but the experience itself remains your own. No one else can step inside it directly. They can understand, they can imagine, but they cannot access it in the way you do. And yet, there is a quiet question that begins to emerge. What if this limitation is not permanent? What if, in some future, it becomes possible not just to describe experience, but to share it? This idea may sound distant, but even now, there are early steps in this direction. Technologies that can detect patterns of brain activity and relate them to what a person is seeing or imagining. Very simple images, reconstructed from signals, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to suggest that something deeper might be possible. You might imagine this like learning a new language, not a language of words, but a language of patterns. The brain, in its activity, carries information about experience, not in sentences, but in rhythms, in connections, in shifting signals across networks. If these patterns can be understood well enough, then perhaps they can be translated, shared, even experienced by another system. This does not mean copying a mind or transferring a person from one place to another. It is something more subtle, more focused, the sharing of a moment, a glimpse, the texture of an experience as it is felt from within. Imagine for a moment being able to experience what another person perceives, not through description, but directly, seeing a colour as they see it, hearing a piece of music as it resonates in their mind, feeling the emotional tone of a memory, not as a story, but as a lived moment. This is not something we can do now, at least not in a complete way. But the possibility itself begins to change how we think about knowledge, because much of what we understand about the world comes from shared descriptions, from language, from explanation. But experience has always remained just beyond that boundary. If that boundary begins to soften, even slightly, a new kind of understanding could emerge, not replacing traditional science, but complementing it. A science that does not only observe from the outside, but explores from within. Some have called this a kind of experiential science, a way of studying consciousness not just by measuring its conditions, but by sharing aspects of the experience itself, not as something mystical, but as something that might one day be approached with the same care and precision that we apply to other areas of research. There is also a deeper implication here, one that's easy to overlook. If experience can be shared, even in limited ways, then the separation between individual minds begins to feel less absolute, not gone, but softened. The idea that each mind is completely isolated begins to shift towards something more connected. You might think of it like standing in separate rooms, each with your own view of the world. Right now, the only way to share that view is to describe it, to point, to explain. But if there were a window, a way to briefly step into each other's perspective, the relationship between those rooms would change. They would no longer feel entirely separate, and this could have a quiet effect on how we relate to one another. Because understanding another person's experience, not just intellectually, but directly, even in a small way, can deepen empathy, can soften misunderstandings, can create a sense of connection that words alone sometimes cannot reach. There is also a more speculative side to this idea, one that touches on creativity and insight. If experiences could be shared, perhaps the way we learn could change. Instead of only studying ideas, we might be able to experience how those ideas feel, how they unfold in the mind of someone who understands them deeply. You might imagine something like sharing the intuitive sense of a complex idea, not the equations or the formal structure, but the feeling of how it fits together, how it moves, how it makes sense from the inside, a kind of understanding that is difficult to put into words, but clear when directly experienced. Again, this is not something that exists in a complete form today. It is direction, a possibility, one that remains uncertain but intriguing. And even if it never fully unfolds in the way we imagine, the idea itself points to something important. That consciousness is not only something to be explained, but something to be explored in new ways, ways that bring us closer to the experience itself. As we sit with this possibility, gently, without needing to resolve it, another shift begins to take place. Because if consciousness can be shared, even partially, and if it may be more widespread than we once thought, then the question of how we relate to the world begins to change, not just scientifically, but ethically, emotionally, in the quiet ways that shape how we see everything around us. And as we move into that final reflection, the focus turns not to what we can know, but to how we might live within a world where consciousness is no longer confined to a single perspective, but part of a much larger interconnected whole. As this journey gently comes to rest, there is one final shift, not in what we know, but in how we feel about what we've explored, because along the way, something subtle has happened. What began as a question about the mind has slowly widened, becoming a question about our place in the world itself, not just what consciousness is, but how it changes the way we see everything around us. If consciousness is something real, something that cannot be reduced entirely to description, then it becomes one of the most important features of existence, not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet, foundational way. Because wherever there is experience, there is something that matters, something that can feel, something that can, in some sense, be affected. And even if we remain uncertain about where consciousness begins, or how far it extends, that uncertainty itself carries weight. It invites a kind of care, a gentle awareness that the boundaries we draw may not be as clear as they seem. You might imagine walking through a quiet forest. The air is still, the light soft, the ground covered in leaves. At first it feels like a place of objects, trees, soil, stones, each separate, each part of a larger landscape. But as your perspective shifts, even slightly, the scene begins to feel different. Not because anything has changed, but because the way you are seeing it has softened. Instead of a collection of separate things, it begins to feel like a network of processes. The trees exchanging gases with the air, the soil alive with unseen activity, the subtle movements of insects, the quiet rhythms of growth and decay, everything interacting, everything influencing everything else. And within that network, the question arises, where does experience exist? Not as a demand for an answer, but as a gentle curiosity. Which of these processes, if any, carry even the faintest trace of something it is like to be? There may be no clear line, no simple boundary that separates experience from non-experience, and so, rather than drawing that line too quickly, we are left with something else, a sense of openness, a willingness to acknowledge that the world may be more layered, more subtle than it first appears. This does not mean that everything is conscious, or that every system has an inner life like our own, but it does suggest that our certainty about these things may need to soften, that the absence of clear evidence is not the same as the absence of possibility, and from this, a quiet ethical shift can emerge, not as a set of rules, but as a way of relating, a recognition that where there might be experience, there is something worth considering, something that deserves a degree of care, even if we do not fully understand it. This does not require dramatic changes or grand conclusions. It can remain simple, a subtle awareness that shapes how we move through the world, how we treat other beings, how we think about systems beyond ourselves, how we respond to the unknown. There is also something deeply connecting in this perspective, because if consciousness is not isolated, if it is not confined entirely within individual minds, then the sense of separation begins to soften, not disappear, but become less rigid. The air you breathe has been part of countless other processes. The molecules in your body have moved through many forms across time. The boundaries that feel so solid begin to appear more fluid, more interconnected, and within this, your own experience and your own awareness becomes part of a larger pattern, not separate from the world, but woven into it. This does not diminish your individuality. It does not erase your identity. It simply places it within a broader context, one that includes everything around you. There is also a quiet comfort in this, because it suggests that you're not alone, not in a simple emotional sense, but in a deeper structural sense. You are part of a continuous unfolding, a process that extends beyond any single moment, beyond any single perspective. And within that unfolding, consciousness itself may be one of the ways the universe becomes aware, not in a grand or mystical way, but in the simple, immediate way you're experiencing right now, the sound of this voice, the feeling of your breath, the subtle presence of being here. Nothing extraordinary, and yet something quietly remarkable, because in this moment, the universe is not just existing, it is being experienced, and that experience, whatever its nature, however it arises, is something we're only beginning to understand. As we come to the end of this exploration, there is no final answer to hold on to, no single conclusion that resolves the mystery. And perhaps that is part of what makes it meaningful, because instead of closing the question, it leaves it open, gently, inviting you to carry it with you, not as a problem to solve, but as a way of seeing, a way of noticing the quiet presence of experience in yourself, and perhaps in the world around you. And so, as your thoughts begin to slow, and the edges of the day soften, you can simply rest with that awareness, not needing to define it, not needing to explain it, just allowing it to be as it has always been. And so, we've reached the end of tonight's exploration. Whether your eyes are still open, or you're already floating somewhere between waking and dreaming, thank you for being part of this little journey. If you'd like to join me again for more gentle wanderings, you're always welcome to subscribe or share this with someone who could use a peaceful pause. Time has a way of slipping through our fingers, but here, in this quiet moment, it's just you and the soft hush of rest. Sleep peacefully, wherever and whenever you may be.